Welcome again. My name is Hillary. I work for MOFGA. I use she, her pronouns, and I work in our community education team. I'm very excited that Caleb is giving this talk. This is actually the second time that he's given this talk within a couple years. There's just so much interest in gardening right now and so many folks who are up for growing their own seedlings, and we're really happy to be able to support you all in learning about this topic. Before we go any further, I would just like to acknowledge that I myself am coming to you from Wabanaki land, now called South Portland, and the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association is located on Wabanaki land in Unity, Maine, where we manage forest, several orchards, fields. Oops. Sorry about that. And I myself and in general here at MOFGA acknowledge that MOFGA is intertwined with colonialist history and that many of the principles and practices of organic agriculture are rooted in thousands of years of Indigenous knowledge. And we're in the process of coming to terms with what that means for our work on and about land. We're working to come to terms with the impacts that colonization and genocide have had on the first people of these lands and take steps in our own lives and collectively toward making reparations. So some of the organizations that we have been working with and learning from are listed on this slide, and I'm going to share links to those organizations in the follow-up email in case anyone would like to learn more from them. First Light Learning Journey, for example, is a really interesting organization that is sort of building a bridge between conservation organizations and Wabanaki people, trying to expand Wabanaki access to lands and create a stronger conservation movement that reflects Indigenous expertise and perspectives. I would also just like to mention a couple of upcoming events that we have. If anyone on this call is also interested in orcharding, we have tons of orcharding events over the next 2 months and beyond. We have pruning and grafting classes. And we also are going to be hosting our Seed Swap and Scion Exchange, which is an annual event that we offer, or that we've been doing for, I think, 39 years. It's been happening, and MOFGA's been involved for many of those years. And that's going to be on March 27th in Unity. And there will also be an opportunity to swap Scionwood in Southern Maine. Just a reminder for folks to please stay on mute throughout the presentation. And we also have a neat gardening webinar coming up in March, Climate Adaptation in the Garden. That's going to be on March 24th, and that will be going up on the website soon, so keep an eye out for that. All right, so Caleb is going to be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to reserve about half an hour for questions at the end. Please feel free to use the chat feature at any point and plug your questions in. If they're super relevant and we have time, I might interrupt Caleb and ask those questions. Otherwise, I'll keep track of them all and try to ask them in order during the Q&A period. And I think that's all of our sort of Zoom logistics. A quick introduction to Caleb. I'm sure he can tell you more about his background, but he does have a PhD in agronomy from the University of Vermont and has been working on farms and working to support farmers for many, many years, and has also been both a farmer and a home gardener. So I think that his knowledge base is really perfect for this type of learning. So thanks a lot, Caleb, for doing this.
So we're going to talk about growing seedlings, in the hopes that we can have nice vegetable plants outdoors. A lot of this information is going to apply to ornamentals as well, but there's differences. I'm focusing primarily on vegetables, seeing as that's usually what most people are looking into as new gardeners. So today we're going to talk about why to start seeds indoors, and also which crops, which ones maybe aren't worth starting early indoors, when to just direct seed instead right into the ground, or perhaps to just buy seedlings. We can talk a little bit about seeds and seedling biology, because that's really what we're dealing with right now. And then a bit on just the basics. What do you need to start your own seedlings indoors? When to do it, and running through some common issues. And if we have time and there aren't a bunch of questions, I have a lot of photos that we can look at that kind of tell a little story in their own. But we'll save that as a maybe kind of topic. So why do we start our seedlings indoors? Some crops need a lot more growing time before we harvest them, or we are hoping to give them as much of a harvest window before frost ends that window. So with cool season crops, we're thinking like Brussels sprouts, it takes a really long time for the plant to grow big enough and make all those sprouts on the side. Onions and leeks, leeks are similar to Brussels sprouts where they take a long time to grow. Onions, they're actually triggered by our long days in the middle of the summer to start bulbing up. So if you start them early, they have as long a time as possible to grow before they start bulbing. And if you have a lot of big growth up top, that's, you know, the solar panels that are going to create sugars and feed that growth of the onion bulb. But if you're a little late in getting them out there, they're going to bulb up at whatever size they're at, and they're going to dry down and be ready for harvest, regardless of what size they're at. Artichokes is sort of a special case. This is actually a biennial plant that, given our climate, we grow as an annual. So we're actually tricking a plant that doesn't flower until its second year of growth to think that it's gone through a year already as a seedling. For that reason, you want to start them early, start them in something mobile so that you can bring them outside maybe and chill them or put them into a fridge, something to trick them into thinking they've gone through a winter after they've already started growing, so that then they think they're in their second year of growth and they will make the flowers. And that's really what an artichoke is. It's that we eat, the part we eat is an unopened flower. And then our heat loving crops. And that's more of what I was saying about that time of that harvest window before frost kills our opportunity. Melons, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, these are all frost sensitive plants. They will die in cold enough temperatures. And the earlier in the season you get them to start bearing, the longer of a window you have where they're going to keep producing fruit that you want to harvest. And there's other crops like that, but just sort of like, that's how I break it down a little bit. Oh, also same vein of thought is annual flowers, you know, zinnias, where if you plant them early and by the time they start blooming, well, you can keep cutting them and deadheading them, and they'll keep producing more flowers all the way through till they're done, either disease or frost takes them out. It's not to say you can't do it later, it's just that you won't have as many flowers as possible, potentially. So as an example, we'll look at melon. This is just an example from a Johnny's catalog from a couple of years ago. So you see right here in this red box, it says 75 days. And what they mean by that, you have to kind of think of when is your first frost in the fall going to be, and also your last frost in the spring. So this is a map of the average last frost dates for Maine. And it's an average, it's not a guarantee or anything, but you can see a lot of Maine is setting into, you know, May all the way up in northern Aristic July. You may even have a frost into like late June. So you have to know where you're going to be and how long your growing season is. But if you look at June 1st as a good like average, right? If you haven't grown before, maybe shoot for June 1st as your planting out date, as in it's safe. We're not expecting frost. Add 75 days to that, and you're hopefully harvesting melons in mid-August. That's important because, you know, our first frost in the fall may come as early as late August. It may come in September. Last year, it didn't really come until much later for most people, but you never know. And the other part is that melons do best in the long, sunny, warm summer days. That's when you're going to get a nice, sweet, juicy melon. If it's not until like September, even if we don't have frost, but it's maybe cooler, the days aren't as long, the plants are going to be a lot more susceptible to disease, and there's just not going to be as much solar energy to produce all the sugars that are going to really sweeten up a melon. So you want it to be ripening as early as you can, essentially. If you could get them in July, that would be fantastic, but anyway, for our planning here, we'll use the 75 days. So that's assuming it's planted June 1st. The big trick here, though, is if you look at elsewhere in the catalog, they say days to maturity, that is from transplanting. If you're direct seeding in the ground, that means you would have to add 10 days to that number. So if you had a transplant and you put it out on June 1st and you direct seeded nearby also on June 1st, you would expect your transplant to be bearing in mid-August, whereas the direct seeded may not be ready until later August, 10 days later on average. And of course, these are all, everything with gardening, it all depends on just how that year's weather goes, but you have to base it off of something. So these are some sort of average rules. And then we look back a little earlier, and their recommendation is to start melons early on in late April. And they're kind of assuming when people are going to be planting them out, or 1 month before transplanting. And honestly, I would err on the side of even less time. So if you're expecting to plant out June 1st, because you think that's when the soil is going to be warm enough, the air is going to be warm enough that the melon plant, which is really a tropical plant, can thrive. Even if it's not freezing, it may just suffer in cold weather. So let's say you're going with June 1st. You have to think about what's 1 month before then. Maybe you're seeding in May 1st, but I would err on it's okay to get a week or so into May before you're even seeding them. This is just one example, but this is how we're thinking about some of our tropical plants. Then another reason why to start seedlings indoors is to give plants a head start. And we were talking about that in terms of how soon it'll be before you can start harvesting them, but it's also just this mismatch we have between sort of prime summer growing conditions and plant development. It takes a long time, even though the days are getting longer. They're already getting longer now. It takes a while for the temperature to catch up to those longer days. So we have, a longer, I'm just hearing beeping, making sure I still have power. You can still hear me, I hope.
Yes.
So we have a longer day that shows up, and by May, the days are just as long as they are in July. But if you think about the temperature and the growing conditions in May versus July, July is a lot more like prime conditions for a tropical plant. If you start a seedling in May, it's only going to be so big before you have big, long, warm days in June. Whereas a larger plant has more leaf surface, it can better use that sunlight that's available to it. So that's getting ready for those prime summer growing conditions. It's just trying to get a little head start so you have the largest plant ready to capitalize on those longer days. Because really, it all turns into a numbers game in terms of how much sunlight you can harvest. And then it's also just for getting ahead of weeds, pests, and diseases. A larger plant tends to have started to be producing enough growth that it can have its own defenses. And it's going to be a little better able to withstand a little weed pressure, a little outcompete weeds, deal with a little bit of pest pressure and a little bit of disease pressure, if they're produced well. So here's an example of tomatoes. That's about when I would want to see them going into the ground, about that stage. That looks like a plant that really is probably filling out the root zone in those little pots. And right now they're getting so big that they're going to crowd each other out, and they're going to start getting leggy as they start competing for light. So it's better to space them out soon, get them in the ground. And this is a commercial farm, so they're about to put them in a greenhouse, but it's still the same idea. If you weren't sure, what are you aiming for? If you're brand new, I would say this is an ideal size to plant them out. I'd rather see you plant out a plant that's a little smaller than this than one that's larger and root bound and a little overgrown. Getting out into the soil, they'll start to grow faster than they can in a pot anyway. And then another reason would be to have controlled germination conditions. And if we think about a little tiny seedling is working off of stored energy, and that is when it's most susceptible to disease. And Also, that early part of the year, I was talking about how it's not really warm enough. Maybe it's been really wet and we don't have the drying out of the longer summer days. So the soil's kind of damp. That's when the seed is going to germinate most slowly because it's too cold. And the disease organisms are probably going to be most competitive and have the best chance of really infecting the seed and causing damage. So if you put 100 seeds out into cold garden soil and 100 seeds into a controlled indoor condition, you're probably going to get most of those 100 to germinate indoors. You may, it just depends on the conditions that year. Who knows how many you're going to get outdoors. It gets better later in the season, and that comes into why we choose to do some things started early and some things we don't. And then another issue that is a big one for a lot of new gardeners is spacing. It's really hard to imagine how big a plant is going to get. And because you also maybe don't know how many of those seeds are going to actually germinate and come through, oftentimes we'll seed a little thicker outdoors and then just plan on thinning them out if we remember to, or if we have the heart to. I know it can be hard to pull out plants that you just put so much effort into getting going. But if you have a discrete seedling, I find that a little easier to be like, okay, I need to space these 8 inches apart. Here's one. I know for myself, I just use this as my measure because I know it's about 8 inches on my hand, just pinky to thumb. And I will then put another plant right over there. Whatever the spacing may be, it's a little easier for me to get a sense of it when it's individual seedlings versus being direct seeded. Here's an example of some peas that I did a couple years ago. You can see that after I transplanted them into the garden, there was snow. Peas don't care about the cold. They can take the cold. However, the seeds will still take a really long time to germinate if the soil is cold. So while they're one of the earliest plants we can direct seed outdoors, if you really want to give them the best shot, you can germinate them inside. You don't have to put as much care and devotion into them as like you may with tomato plants, where you're thinking about a long-term, you're growing them for a while indoors and then you're growing them all summer. Whereas peas, you tend to have maybe several plantings. So I transplanted these peas. I also direct seeded some peas shortly afterwards in the same garden nearby. And those direct seeded ones, many of them didn't make it. They didn't emerge. They just had damping off in the soil. They had disease get to them. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why I like to start things indoors. This is a little excessive. Most people don't do that, but I had reason to want to push these peas as early in the year as I could. So it depends on your situation and what you're trying to do. And one other, so back to our list, the why start them indoors continued. You may be able to save money on seedlings and seeds. For the reasons I said before, if you're not thinning out seeds, then that means you're using less seeds. If you're not losing seedlings to damping off because it never made it out of the soil, then you're not using as many seeds. And you know, that's important in terms of the past couple of years with the pandemic. Many more people have taken up gardening, and a lot of the seed companies have struggled with availability. I think they've gotten a hold of it this year, probably. I haven't heard any of the same complaints yet, but just in terms of availability as well. So just saving on the number of seeds. And the last couple of years, people were worried, could they even get all the seed that they wanted? And then for me, it's a little bit back to like, why was I planting those peas really early? It's for the fun of it. I get impatient. I try to rush spring, especially weather like we've just had. You know, I get out there and I start stomping the ice and breaking it apart so it melts a little faster. It's maybe not the best personality trait, but it is just a part of me. And I know a lot of other gardeners can't wait to start thinking about spring. I would advise, you know, try to temper it. Like I was saying earlier, a seedling that was started too early is going to be worse off than a seedling that was started just a little bit too late. So some of the crops that are more commonly direct seeded that we don't usually seed indoors, we don't usually start as transplants, would be really short season crops, things that don't take long to go from seeding to harvest. So that would be small greens like a lettuce mix, whereas a head lettuce, you're letting it grow a little bit bigger till it forms a head. I like to transplant those. But lettuce mix, you're only letting it so big, like sort of baby leaf lettuce, and then you're cutting it, and maybe you're letting it regrow, but you want kind of like a thick planting of it. Similar with arugula, which grows very quickly. Some of the quicker root crops, turnips, radishes, it just doesn't make sense to transplant them. It's not to say you can't. I have definitely spring turnips. I do still transplant them. And I kind of lump them back, those into our potentially difficult to transplant or just particularly easy to direct seed. So some of our root crops, carrots and parsnips, they don't take transplanting very well unless you are very prompt. And honestly, unless you're having an issue with your direct seeding of carrots or parsnips, I would advise do not transplant them. But as soon as they germinate, they immediately send down a taproot. And your transplant cell, your tray, your container, whatever you're starting them in, doesn't really have enough of depth for them. So you could start them and then plant them out really soon when they're just tiny little seedlings, but they're going to be tender. It's sort of tricky. It's better not to do it unless you're having some other reason why your carrots and parsnips just will not germinate when you're direct seeding. Then you could experiment with it. Beans and peas, most people don't bother transplanting. For my first planting of the year, I like to transplant them. They're often listed as difficult to transplant. I don't consider them to be difficult to transplant at all, but that's because I know when to get them out into the garden and not to leave them in their trays for a long time. They're pretty susceptible to getting root bound and overgrown, and that'll set them back quite a bit. So you don't want old transplants going out of beans and peas. Just a little trick there that this photo is to remind me of, if you are direct seeding them, you can pre-soak them for a little bit, and that'll get them going, and it'll kind of they'll make them germinate a little bit faster, gives them a head start. Some herbs, dill, cilantro, I wouldn't bother transplanting. They direct seed very easily. They're very cold hardy. They often self-seed wherever you had them. If you let them go to seed the year before, you'll see them coming up again the next year. Some other herbs like basil, I'd rather transplant. So it varies. And then when to buy seedlings. I'm going to go on record and say it is not a problem to buy seedlings. You're not a failure, and you're not necessarily getting anything inferior as long as you're getting them from a good trusted source. It may cost more than, one tomato seed is going to cost you a lot less than a entire tomato seedling from a nursery or a farm. But you're paying for that farmer's knowledge. You're paying for the potting mix they're using, which sometimes is maybe a little nicer than what we can get as home gardeners. Not always. They may have amendments that only make sense to add on a farm scale that don't make sense to buy and try to use on a garden scale. Some of our microbial inoculants, like, it's hard to buy them in a small enough quantity to make sense for a garden, but growing a lot of seedlings, you may want to use them. There's a product called Root Shield is an example of something like that. And just the limitations of our own seedling setups, right? It takes space. You need to be able to provide heat and light depending on the crop. Some of these you're going to need more heat, some you're going to need more light, and just the timing. Like, at some point, most folks who are starting their own seedlings, wherever they're starting them is getting pretty cramped right before they want to plant out, because they have everything ready to go out as early as they can when they think the frost risk is over. And then crop failure happens to the best of us. Maybe you overwatered something too many times and it damped off, and you lost your seedlings. They just died. Maybe the cat laid on the seedling tray, or maybe you're just having seed availability issues. Like I was saying, that variety of tomatoes you want to grow wasn't available, and you just got to run out and buy something. There's some other ones for me, like rosemary. I think I'm going to buy some rosemary seedlings that somebody else started. It takes a really long time to get them big enough to do much growth in our year, and it's not worth my time to start them as early as I would need to with the light and the heat that they would want to grow well. So it's just a little bit of I'd rather pay somebody else to have spent that money to heat the seedlings in a bright greenhouse where they've been receiving a lot of light. They're going to be high quality. Ideally, you of course need to shop well, find your trusted suppliers, but it is a possibility. We do have a map of where you can buy certified organic seedlings, either direct on farm, or I believe these orange spots are like co-ops and things that resell seedlings. And I don't think it's been updated for this year, but it's going to be largely the same as it was last year. We just, before May, someone at MOFGA is going to be running through and making sure these farms are still certified, things like that, and that they're still selling seedlings. And then now I'll take this is my chance to take a drink of water. Excuse me. Seed and seedling biology, because really all this is applied biology. And the more you know about the plants, the better you're going to understand what to do and why things are happening the way they're happening. So a seed is a sleeping baby with a lunchbox and a coat of armor. And I have two examples here. One is a bean representative of like broad-leaved plants. These are called dicots. They have 2 cotyledons, and you'll see what those are in a minute. And here's an onion seed, and that's an example of a grass type plant, a monocot. So dicots are most of our garden vegetables. They tend to have a big long stem, not always a taproot, but often a taproot. And so that stem is made up of internodes and nodes. And the nodes are where things happen. It's where leaves grow out. It's where flowers come out. It's where new stems maybe shoot off. And that's the same thing in a monocot. However, think of that stem as being incredibly compressed. So all of those nodes are all in one spot. So if you think about an onion, that base plate at the bottom, that is the stem. It's all just smushed together, and everything above it is an individual leaf that has been wrapped together. They're modified leaves. So that would be, so looking at our dicot model again, our embryo, that's the baby. It's our baby plant. It has its first leaves coming right there. They're already formed. And it has a radicle, which is the fancy name for just the initial root. It has the seed coat that's protecting it. It's maybe keeping it from taking up water too soon. If it's still on the plant, you don't want it to get wet and start germinating before it's hit the soil. Most veggie plants have a seed coat that will let water in, and they'll start to soak it up and start waking up that embryo, get it waking up and starting to grow. But some plants, like morning glory seeds, have a very tough seed coat, and that needs to be abraded to let water in. So it's a little bit crop specific. If you ever have any questions, you're wondering, why did my seedling never germinate? That's one thing to check out is, do you need to do something to treat the seed coat to get it to take up water? And then cotyledons, they're called seed leaves. It's really energy storage. That's, if you think about this bean seed, that is the meat of the bean, right? That is where all the starch that we eat is in there. And that is going to be the food source for the baby until it can get up, make its own leaves that are green, that are photosynthesizing and sending their own energy back down to the root. Onion seed, going to be similar, except it only has one cotyledon. That's why it's a monocot, and the other ones are called dicots, and it's a big division in flowering plants. But think of it in terms of grass-like plants and broad-leaved plants, and that's the simple way. You can see an onion seed germinates, it sends the radicle up and out, and then this cotyledon elongates and it kind of grows all the way through. The stem is just down here. It's that tiny little compressed stem, and the leaves are all going to emerge from there. So that's going to dictate a little bit about the plant, right? When people are doing onion seedlings, they'll often cut them like grass, take shears and just trim the tops, and that's fine because it is like growing like a grass. It's all coming from that growth point way down below. But like a tomato plant, the main primary growth point is up at the top where it's sending out new growth, and that stem is elongating from there. So most of our dicots, maybe not most of them, many of them are going to grow like this, where the seed is planted, it sends out the radical, and then it actually lifts its cotyledons up out of the ground. And you can see the growth point. There's the first true leaves. You know, we have our seed leaves, the cotyledons, they're fueling all that growth. Then you have true leaves that come up and the stem elongates, and you have nodes and that where all the action's happening. That's where the buds are and the leaves, and the inner nodes, which is just the meat of the stem that's giving it its height. So here's an example of a squash plant. You can see the seed was planted under the soil, but it's already, the root has gone down, it's pulling up moisture, it's about to flip that seed all the way up out of the soil. And here's some cucumbers where they've already done it. And you can see they brought the seed coat up with them. So that's one of the things to expect with many of our crops. Some of the other ones like peas or corn, the seed stays in the soil. So here it is, it sends its radical down and it sends its shoot up. So for peas, which are a broadleaf, they're dicot, the cotyledons stay down there in the soil, and then you get true leaves and growth coming up from above, and the growth point is up above. Something like corn, the growth point stays right down there, and it just is sending leaves up until it starts really elongating. And, you know, tall corn stalks, once you can start to see the joints in between the sections, the stem has started to elongate because it's starting to flower, but it takes a while before it gets there. And for the most part, that growth point is under the soil. And I forget why I threw this in here, but I don't want to take too much time. So here are some seedlings, some pea seedlings as a good example. This shows how little you really need if you want to do something casual, right? Like peas don't need a lot of heat. So here they are in a warm, sunny window. My main goal here is just to get them germinated up out of the soil so they can start making their own energy. You can, even though I just said that they keep the seed below the soil, this one was planted not very deep, so it did end up getting pushed up. Doesn't really matter, but that just shows you where the cotyledons are. And you can see this root ball down there. So the plant has not gotten very big. It only has a few true leaves, and it's already filled out that root ball pretty well. That's about an ideal stage to plant it out. And that's going to be true for many of our seedlings. The timing is going to vary, and every crop is different. So you have to get this is part of why gardening experience helps. The more you do it, the more you're going to know. But with something that's growing quick like this, that's as long as I want to leave it in the tray. A lot of what we're talking about with seedlings and where the issues come about and how it goes well, it really all boils down to that root ball. You can see in my little drawing here, here's the plant, and it emerges. And what we were just talking about is kind of this one on the left here. That's about the roots are holding the root ball together. They've explored, they're able to access the fertility and the water all around, but they're not cramped yet. Eventually, they're going to start getting cramped. They're going to use up all the fertility that's in that soil. They're going to start circling in upon themselves, and then that makes it harder. Even when you pull them out, if the roots start going in a circle and they kind of get stuck and they don't want to branch out and explore the soil that they get planted into. So the roots are providing the seedlings with support. You know, they're just straight up giving the anchor to hold up the plant. We all know that they're how the plant takes up water. With that water is fertility, which needs to be in there. Really easy to forget about is that roots need air. They need oxygen. We think of plants as needing carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen because they're photosynthesizing. They are still using oxygen the same way you and I do. When they're photosynthesizing, they're fixing carbon, they're making sugar, and they are producing oxygen as a byproduct. But then later, they're still using that sugar to fuel their growth. And that's called respiration. It's the same thing you and I do when we eat sugars and we use that to fuel our actions. You combine that with oxygen, and it's like controlled burning. So the plant still needs oxygen. And that's particularly true of the roots, which aren't doing any photosynthesizing, right? So in that leaf, it's producing some oxygen, it's using it up in the same spot. In the roots, they need oxygen in order to burn the sugars that are being moved down to them from the leaves. And then space. Eventually, they're going to get cramped, and it's going to hinder the top growth of the plant. So here's the same pea seedlings a little bit later. You can see they're starting to get, this one would still be fine. And especially, I know the roots aren't too tender. You could sort of tease these apart gently, and they would be able to explore the soil that they get planted into. But this is showing me like, that probably should have already gone into the ground, at least for a pea or a bean plant. Now, talking about space and water and things this plants need. Here's my terrible cheesy drawing. Think of this orange square as if you were doing a small seedling cell like that pea was in, versus a much larger container. If you add water, and it's going to go down in there, and yeah, the plant's going to soak up some of the water, but until it has leaves where it's actually like evaporating the water back out again, it's not going to move too much from the soil back out to the air. If you think about what volume of water is in this little square, it's much less than what is in this overall big pot. This seedling in here is going to be stuck in wet soil for a long time. That water is going to force out the air, so there's not going to be as much oxygen. It's a sitting duck for disease organisms. It's not going to do great. Whereas this one, it's going to dry out faster. You're going to need to water it more often, but that's a good thing because that means air is getting back in there and it's able to breathe a little. So I prefer to start a seedling in a smaller container, especially something that's going to be a seedling that you keep for a long time indoors. Those peas, I wasn't keeping them for a long time. They were maybe going to be indoors for a week or two at the most. So they can be in those small containers and then go straight outside. For something like a tomato, where you're going to start them and they're going to take a while to get big enough that they're going to actually go outside, I like to start them in a smaller space where they're not stuck and in damp, wet conditions for a long time. And then as it's emerged, put it into a larger space so that it can utilize it better. So that's not exactly what's happening here. This is a different picture, but I'm using it to pretend that that's what's happening here, because you can do a similar thing where you start your seedlings in a tray and then you do a process called pricking them out, and you just prick out individual seedlings very carefully. It does take some skill. Plant a few more than you think you're going to need because you might kill a couple as you're getting used to it. And then you make a hole in wherever you're going to pot them up into and get them going. Here's an example of some tomatoes that have just been pricked out of a tray and put into pots. You can see, they just got a little shock. It's going to set them back a teeny tiny bit, but it's, in the end, I find a better process for a plant that's going to be in the ground for a while. And then that picture, you can see the seed leaves right here. These are the cotyledons, and then you can see the true leaf emerging in the middle. Everything below these seed leaves is considered hypocotyl. It's the $5 word. It just means the part of the stem that's below the cotyledons, below the seed leaves. And all of that tissue is essentially root tissue. So I like to plant them a little bit deeper, but I like to keep the cotyledons above the soil. If I were at this farm, I would want those planted a little bit deeper in that seedling mix. So you might have to make a bigger hole. You might have to bend the stem a tiny bit carefully. Like I said, take some experience, take some technique, start off with more than you think you need. And also maybe don't water them right before you do this, because if they're watered, they're full of high pressure water, and that can make it easier to snap the stem. So if you don't want them totally wilted, you just don't want them fresh, full of water pressure. You can do this and then water them immediately after to give them, help the roots reconnect with the new potting soil they're in and relieve some of the stress on the plant. This is a picture, clearly not a garden vegetable. This is a jade plant from my house, but it was a nice example of how the distinction between node and internode. So here's an internode, and then there's the node where the leaves are coming out, and it's also got some adventitious rooting. It's basically saying if there were soil here, these roots would go into it. Many of our garden plants, but not all of them, can do this as well. Again, don't do this unless you know the plant can tolerate it. But tomatoes are one example. You'll often hear people say you can plant them deep if you need to, if the seedlings get too tall. It's still not necessarily the best thing to do, but if you need to, if they're really leggy and they need more support, you can put them in a little bit deeper. But think about it in terms of this, like the roots are mostly going to be coming out of a node, if at all, depends on the plant species. All right, another water break, and then getting into the meat of just what do you actually need? So you probably need a container of some sort to hold the soil. And more importantly, to hold the water that is going to be applied to the soil and that's going to leak out. Otherwise, you're going to have a very, very messy room wherever you're keeping these. You need some drainage. You don't want that water to sit in there. So the container should have a hole, at least one hole to let water drain out. I like to have seedlings in containers with a fair amount of drainage and then a little bit of airspace below that. You know, maybe put in something to just hold that tray up from that container up from a tray that's going to catch the water. And that way they're not sitting in the water, but also the water is not spilling out all over my floor. That's sort of my ideal setup. You're going to need some sort of seed starting mix. There's many commercial ones available. Some people swear by this one or that one or this one or that one. Some people make their own. It's going to boil down to what works for you, and it may hinge on the other aspects of how you grow things and your personality even. Like, are you someone that waters frequently, or are you someone who forgets to water? A different potting mix may work better for one personality than the other. You're going to need to be able to provide light to the seedlings. And here's another one that trips up a lot of new gardeners, is that you need a lot more than you think. The ambient light in your house is not going to be enough. You're going to get leggy seedlings that are stretching. Except, you know, the caveat there is like that peas in the windowsill that I showed you. If you're just trying to get them up out of the ground and you're putting them into the soil really quick, they don't even have a chance to get leggy. It's not really that big of a deal. But anything that you're going to keep in a tray or in a container indoors for more than a week and a half, I would say you're going to need lights. And then heat, it's going to vary based on the crop. Some of them are cool season. They don't mind being a little bit cooler. Some of them are really warm season crops, and they are not going to do great if they don't have enough warmth to get germinated. And it's not that they won't germinate. In most cases, often they will still germinate. It just takes them a lot longer to. And the longer they're in the wet soil without their own leaves sending energy back in to kind of make new root growth and build their defenses, they become sitting ducks over time to potential disease.
Hey, Caleb.
And for that reason, yeah.
Time check is just, I think we're about maybe 7 minutes off the 45 mark.
Okay. So that heat, the most important part, that's why it's for actually getting the seedling to germinate and get above the soil. After that, they can actually tolerate cooler temperatures, more like your ambient household temperature for most people. If you keep your house somewhere between 60 and 75 degrees, a lot of these plants are going to be just fine after they've germinated. And so you may want to have just a warm spot to at least get them germinated. I like to keep my seedlings in the dining room where I have a wood stove, and it's the warmest room in the house, and they all grow a lot better there. But they still get cool at night and they're fine. And of course you need seeds. Yeah.
Sorry. One question we just got, like, are there any seeds that you really don't need to have a heat source for? Or
onions don't need much. Spinach doesn't need much. I'm not saying you have to go to Johnny's Seeds for your seeds. By all means, I buy seeds from so many different companies, but they have these really nice graphs in their catalog. So at least look on their website or in their catalog just to inform yourself of the optimal germination temperature. And you can see by crop what temperature they do best at. And there's, of course, other sources of that information. You can Google, tomatoes, optimal germination temperature, and you're going to get lots of responses. And it varies by crop, but in general, most of our cold hardy crops tend to be able to germinate better in cooler conditions than our heat loving crops. So here's our peas again, there they are. They didn't need any additional heat. They don't need additional light because they're going to go back out. They're going to go outside shortly. I'm flubbing in this picture. It's a lie. You can see the snow outside the window, but it was just for the photo op. The other thing here, though, and you don't need all that extra light. It is a good example. You can see they're starting to lean towards the window. If you had something that was going to be there for a long time, the light coming in the window just is not going to be enough. Here's somebody's home setup. They're getting the light from the window. That's a good thing. But this silver bar you see on the right, that is supplemental lighting. They are adding additional light, and that is going to be needed. And they've got their trays. They've got their mix. You can see they're using different trays. Some of them are probably recycled. And this is what a lot of our farmers will use, but it also works for gardens. There's a lot of other things in the home garden. A certified organic farmer may not be able to use old milk cartons, but if you're an organic gardener that's not certified, it's, you use what you're comfortable with. They've also cut open some old plastic bottles. The main concern I have with this kind of setup is that I would just want to make sure that there's enough drainage holes. Because those containers are going to hold that water, and you need the water to drain out so that there's enough air going back into the soil. Similar situation with somebody made their own newspaper pots, and that actually would be allowed in certified organic farming. Newspaper is allowed as long as it's black ink and not glossy. Again, I'm just concerned that you need to make sure it's draining. I mean, yes, the water will soak into the newspaper, but it's not going to drain out the same way it would as if there's a hole in the bottom. So I would still make some snips in the bottom just to make sure water can drain out. I experimented with some toilet paper roll pots that I made, and I just made a couple cuts in the bottom and folded them over. It went fine. I left a nice big hole for drainage. I have other seedling, I kind of use whatever, I play around. Those are peat pots, these bigger circles down near the bottom on the right. That's just compressed peat. That's also going to start breaking down in the garden. But either way, you're probably going to end up pulling that off around the root ball before you plant it. Depends on the crop. This is from a MOFGA publication about starting your own onions. This is how I did it last year. It worked great. They don't actually need as much space as many of the other crops. So look at how densely planted these are. Each one of those plants is going to become an individual onion. And when you plant it out, you're going to need to give them more space, but they're going to be fine like that. And you can just keep trimming them back a little bit and keep them happy. Again, going to need drainage holes. Soil blocks is another option. I don't recommend this to new gardeners. Better to just get used to growing first. But essentially it's a compressed potting mix, and you water the entire tray. That tray helps collect the water. And this is the gadget that they use to make it. These can be pretty expensive. I don't bother with these personally, but that doesn't mean they don't make a nice transplant. It's just, for me, it's not worth the expense. I have some reusable seedling containers that I really like. And then the ingredients of potting mixes. Most of them contain peat. Coir is a renewable alternative that's been growing in popularity. That's like coconut fiber. Vermiculite helps improve aeration, hold in water. Perlite is probably more common. That's the bigger, fluffier white pieces you see. That's exploded volcanic rock. It really helps add aeration spots in the mix. So if you've been suffering with damping off soil mix that's too wet, add more perlite if it doesn't have enough already. They all need to have some sort of fertilizer. A conventional mix will have synthetic fertilizer. An organic mix is going to have natural, plant meals or mined mineral sources of nutrients. And a lot of organic potting mixes or potting mixes made for organic growing tend to have compost in them. It helps hold moisture and it's a fertility source. So there's all sorts of different ones out there, and it's going to be what works best for you. Here's a comparison of two different compost-based potting mixes. It really can be rough. You want to go with a trusted supply. If you're having issues, maybe try another type of potting mix and just compare. These are seedlings transplanted at the same exact time into different mixes. And so it really can matter how well the compost was made. Some people make their own with their own compost. Just make sure you know that you have good compost, that it's well matured. It's not going to be a problem. Lights, here's a farmer set up some cheap LED shop lights. They made some wooden shelves. I really like this system. Very sturdy. The only thing I don't like about it is that if you see these plants are about hitting the lights. So this farmer has got to get those out. I mean, they're already getting pretty big anyway, but there's not much room for more growth. So I like something that's more adjustable. You can see this farmer, and what home gardeners do often are setups like these, and it's the same as many of our small farmers. So these lights are adjustable. Those shelves are adjustable. You can make some spaces bigger for plants that you're going to keep indoors for a lot longer so they can keep growing, and you can raise and lower the lights. You'll notice these are fancy lights. They have the color spectrum that's only the spectrum that the plants are going to use. And that's really important for long-term growing, like people who grow pot indoors in their closets and stuff. They need that special color spectrum, maybe. For our purposes, I say just use cheap shop lights, LED shop lights, cool white. These lights are typically very expensive, and I don't think you're going to see that much of a difference in your seedlings, like at all. I use cheap LED shop lights. If you already have fluorescent tubes, just keep using them. They're not going to be that much more energy than an LED shop light. And maybe when they die, think about replacing them with LEDs. But fluorescent tubes, LEDs, fine. They're relatively cheap, and they do just great. The most important thing is look at how bright that is. Even though it's odd colors, right? It should still show up as very bright to you. This is another one. This is pretty ideal. Cheap shop lights, maybe. Oh, I see a brand name. And maybe this is somebody who has specific grow lights. Anyway, what you're looking for is high light intensity, a couple inches above the plants. Make sure, and it looks pretty uniform across that whole tray. Here's another setup. There they are near their heat source. The window is the source of light. Probably going to be okay, but ideally you'd have a little bit more light, and you'd also worry that this heat source may be drying things out. Then again, those pots are really big. Maybe you want them to dry out a little faster. On the right is a really nice ideal, cheap shelving. It's adjustable. The lights can be raised or lowered. And then they also have heat mats. So this is both instances of different ways to provide enough heat, at least to germinate things. You'll notice those humidity domes can be handy for germinating things. I tend to not bother. And then as soon as plants are up, unless it's a plant that specifically needs really high humidity, and most of our garden plants don't, I do not like to have humidity domes. Or if you know that you're in a very drying situation where they're at risk of drying out and being damaged, I would much rather have that airflow around them and reduce the chance of disease.
Hey, Caleb, how many hours a day do you keep the lights on?
So I like a minimum of 12 hours. This is another one where like people growing pot, the hours that they, if you Google how many hours of light, you're going to find lots of results of people talking about growing pot in closets and things like that. That's one where that influences the flowering of the plant, which is the part that they want to harvest. But for seedlings, for most of our garden crops, they're not going to be as affected by that. So it's more just about providing enough light to give them that energy. Like I was saying, a lot of this is a numbers game of how much light can your plants capture. I like to give them at least some dark period. I don't think it's necessarily critical. I think you could leave them on all night, but I like to run my lights maybe 14 hours a day and 8 hours, no, 10 hours, I guess that would be. Yeah, 14 to 16, 8 to 10 hours off maybe. And like I had said earlier, oh, so sorry, I started reading the bottom of my slide without reading the top. When do you start? The best thing is to work off your old records and just figure out, okay, last year I did this too early and I did this too late. I'm going to adjust a little bit. But of course, if you've never done it before, you don't have your own records. There's a lot of different seed starting calendars to work off of. They provide a nice example. And then the best thing to do is keep your own records. I always have lofty goals of keeping really detailed records. I'm not very good at it. So I like to try to take pictures on my phone, and then I can always look back at that camera roll because the pictures have dates associated with them. And that really helps me figure things out. And again, you know, unless you know that something absolutely needs to be started really early, and if you don't get it before this time, then it's just too late. It's better off to be too late than too early, most of the time. Often a smaller plant outdoors is going to catch up to a larger plant that is maybe stunted by being in the pot too long. So here's MOFGA's example of a planting calendar of when to get things started. And this is both for starting things outdoors and starting them indoors. And I think it's a really nice starting point. Everybody's going to be different. There's a lot of different microclimates in Maine. So you'll have to adjust as needed. Also, you know, you might want to plant your tomatoes when they're only this big, or you might want to let them get really big and bump them up into larger pots and have just giant tomato plants that you're putting out there. That's great, but you're going to want to adjust when you start your seeds, if that's the case. You know, it's all personal. Here's another calendar from High Mowing Seeds. Just another good example of what you can, the information out there. All these seed companies, they want you to have success. So they've created their own resources. Here's Johnny's. You can actually put in when you think your frost-free date is, and they will suggest how many weeks to start seeding before that date, and they'll actually give you a date. So that's another way you can play around with looking at these things. And then if we still have time for common issues, damping off is the big one. That's what we talked about a lot. Those are several different diseases that can get into your seedlings before they get big enough to be strong enough to resist them. And they typically tend to be from cold, wet conditions, or just not enough good microbes to fend them off. And again, it's those cold, wet conditions that are not great for the good microbes, and these other ones tend to be more tolerant of those conditions. I also talked a lot about plants being overgrown, root bound or pot bound, or in other ways that we describe that same thing. Leggy seedlings, that's when they've been in the same pot for maybe, it can be combined with overgrown. They've been in there for too long. They're getting crowded and they start competing for light. And so they start growing longer and skinnier, trying to reach that light. This will also happen just if there isn't enough light. If you're not giving them bright enough light, they will think that they're surrounded, that they're planted close together and that they need to stretch to reach the sun. Leggy plants are not great. They tend to be more susceptible to pests and diseases. And then hardening off plants. This is really tricky. This is after you've done all the work to make your beautiful seedlings, you've babied them. You need to harden them off before they go out into the harsh outdoor world. So here's damping off as our example. You can see the stem is, the seedling just flopped right over. The stem looks quite unhealthy right there. Maybe they went into a large tray too early. Maybe the compost isn't that healthy. Maybe it just kept too wet. Here's some more damping off in lettuce seedlings. A lot of the damping off that happens is actually before the seedling can even emerge. So when you see seedlings that didn't emerge at all, they damped off, meaning they were infected by these same diseases in the soil and they just never made it up. this is what pictures are a lot easier after they've made it up and they still damp off because they're just babies and they haven't really gotten a tough stem growing yet. This is that example of being pot bound a little bit. This is just the beginning. It can get much worse than that. This is getting leggy. They're reaching for that sun. Let's say I wanted to keep these indoors for a while longer, I might turn them around and then they'll start bending the other way. But as they do that, the way plants bend towards a light source, they're elongating the side of the stem that's away from the light. And so it's more growth. And that means they're going to get leggier as they keep stretching to go in the direction of the light. Yeah, here's my example of, there they are. They're reaching for that light. That's without supplemental lighting. The only light they're getting that's strong is from the window. They are going to do whatever they can to maximize it. This is an example of not enough hardening off. We think about it in two ways. One is cold hardy plants where you know there's some risk of them getting cold damage. You just expose them to cooler and longer periods of time gradually at these cooler temperatures. And so they start making compounds that kind of prevent them from freezing and getting freeze damage. This is not a cold hardy plant. This is a squash. The damage we see here is actually sunburn. This is a plant that was grown indoors. It was under lights, but probably not enough light. The leaves are, a plant is never going to put more resources towards something that it doesn't need to if it can help it. So growing in a shadier condition, they're not making their leaf as prepared as it should be for the harsh, bright sun of outdoors. And so they need a little bit of time. This was my own seedling. I left it out I was in the process of hardening it off, but I left it out for too long that first day and it still got sunburned. You can see this line on the lower leaf is where the green spot up above that isn't sunburnt because it was shaded by the upper leaf. And that's kind of my proof positive that that was a sunburn issue, not something else. And you can see it just totally bleached out the chlorophyll. It destroyed that part of the plant, which is so important for actually doing the photosynthesizing. This is called wind whip. This is a sensitive, tall pepper seedling. It got put out into hot black plastic mulch and there was probably strong winds. And so that's not disease that caused it to keel over like that. It looks like damping off, but it's really just the tissue was not prepared for the heat and the wind. So I'm gonna try to leave it there. Happy gardening. Time to start your seeds. Depending on the one, I haven't actually started any of my own yet, but I'm going to be probably looking at my onions soon. Lots of links, and I think we can always offer those later.
Yeah, I'll share those in the follow-up email with everyone.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Caleb. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to jump right in. A couple just came in, or a few that came in over the course of the hour about hardening off. Since you were just talking about that. So the first one, somebody said, when hardening off, do I need to bring them inside at night? And must you harden to the outdoors if you're bringing them to a greenhouse?
Good questions. So it depends. It's all going to vary. If you want to harden them towards the conditions that they're going to go into. If you had them hardened off so that they're ready for the outdoors, they're going to do great in a greenhouse, but they probably don't need to have as much babying, or not babying, as much of a runway to that being hardened off, because that greenhouse is going to be protecting them. But that first day that you open the sides of that greenhouse, assuming that there are sides that open up and wind comes whipping through, this is the other thing I didn't mention with hardening off, is a lot of it is also about a waxy layer on the leaf surface that protects it from losing moisture. And if you bring them from indoors where they haven't had a lot of airflow, they have not had a reason to build up that protective layer. And you bring them outside, there's a lot of wind, it's going to pull moisture right out of that plant and it's going to wilt and, like, again, die from too much sun with not enough water because it just lost all the water to the wind. So that could still happen the first time that those plants are getting a lot of wind through a greenhouse. Whether or not you need to bring them into your own house, it just depends on your own setup. Sometimes if you have it bright enough, and ideally you may have an oscillating fan in your setup area, it's going to keep air flowing. It's going to keep your leaves from being too wet where they might get disease issues. And it's also going to encourage them to make that stronger, waxier barrier. It's all going to vary. You're going to have to experiment with what you've got. I like to harden them off a little bit at a time. So if it hasn't been outdoors at all yet, I like to put it out for just a short amount of time, either with partial sun and a little bit of access to airflow, you know, some protection from sun, some protection from wind, and then gradually over time, do longer periods of time. You know, what you can do is going to vary quite a bit on just your own circumstances. If you don't have much time, putting row cover over the plant, like hoops and row covers, it's a great thing in a garden if you have that ability. It's going to protect at least from the wind, and it's going to provide a little bit of shading. So that's another nice way you can kind of harden things off.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Caleb. And one sort of follow-up, a couple more hardening off questions. One person asked, does damping off ever, or sorry, not hardening off, but damping off, does damping off ever come from bad air?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, it's usually fungal diseases or diseases that are similar to fungi, and sometimes bacteria. And those are usually it's one reason why you want clean trays. If you've used them before, maybe clean them out. You want good potting mix because it's the presence in the mix. They often live on decaying organic matter. There's always potential, I guess they could be spreading by spores in the air, but that's not really a problem. What that may be suggesting, you know, like bad air, quote unquote, might be not enough airflow, so things aren't drying out. You know, you want that. We saw in the damping off pictures, the stem right above the soil line was where it flopped over. You want the soil down where the roots are to be moist. Up above, you know, you don't want the surface of the soil to stay wet for too long. So if you didn't have good airflow, then maybe you could call that bad air, and that might lead to conditions like that.
Okay, great. I think you covered this a little bit, but one person asking, is it okay to seed into a larger pot so that you don't have to pot up later on?
Yeah, I mean, it's okay as long as it's working for you. I would just say if you're running into issues, maybe think about trying things differently. It's going to depend on your potting mix, the plants that you're growing, and your frequency of watering and things like that. So okay. It's a big, it depends.
Yeah, okay. Let's see, a couple quick ones here. One person asked, can seedlings be started in an indoor pool room? Is that something you recommend?
I don't see why not, as long as it's warm enough and there's enough sunlight and decent airflow. I mean, it may be ideal, honestly.
Okay.
I could imagine a pool room maybe being high humidity. So that's one thing I'd worry about. Make sure there is enough airflow so that humid air isn't becoming stagnant around the plants.
Okay. And are there any plants where you recommend pinching or snipping the tops to create stronger or bushier plants while they're seedlings?
Yeah, some people do that with peppers. Depends on how big my pepper plants are when I'm planting them out. The idea being that, you know, if you either take the entire top growing point and force it to branch out, or you just remove the first set of pepper blossoms. And that's usually what I do, is I take off the first set of flowers, and then the plant devotes more energy to making more plant, which can support more flowers. But, you know, it's hard enough as it is to get sweet peppers up where I am. So it's always a little bit of a gamble, right? Like, will these, if I pinch off this first one, does that mean I'm not going to get any ripe ones? So it depends on where that is. With onions and leeks, I like to give them a haircut. I like to trim them back like a finely manicured lawn. It's just kind of fun. It keeps them clean, gives me something to do. It may make for a stockier, sturdier transplant as well, which is one reason why I like to do it. And they are a plant that tolerates that very well.
Okay, great. On the pepper topic, where you started, a couple different people wanted any pepper germination tips you might have, saying that that's a crop that's been really challenging for folks.
So making sure it's warm enough. Peppers are tropical plants. They don't need to be very deep in the soil. And I like to do, so what I did last year that worked really well for me is I started most all of my crops in these little tiny trays, and they're on, to be honest with you, they are the trays that mushrooms come in when we buy them from Hannaford. And I just take a little hacksaw and I cut drainage slits in the bottom, put them in with, put my potting mix in there, make little rows, do my seeding, not very deep. And I get a line of pepper plants. And then when they're up and they've got their seed leaves and they're 1.5 inches tall, maybe, I pop that whole thing out and I tease them apart very gently and put them in their individual pots, individual containers in a tray that I do my peppers in. I think usually if folks are having an issue, it's temperature, maybe too much water. They need enough water, but you don't want to keep them drowned.
Okay, great. Let's see, a couple quick ones. Have you ever started seedlings in paper tubes? I think like toilet paper roll type tubes. Would that work well?
So I think I have. I think I would rather put a transplant in it, a very small seedling, and get that going. But yeah, I think I did broccoli a couple of years ago like that, and I think it was fine.
Okay.
It would just depend on what you were growing.
Yeah. Okay. And do you recommend pre-soaking anything other than peas before planting those?
I mean, a lot of it depends on what you're planting with. This is one of those areas where gardeners actually have the advantage over farmers, is that if you're seeding by hand, you can pre-soak them and you can do peas and beans, big seeds. I think you can do it with other ones. I haven't really looked into it crop by crop. It's another, you could just Google whatever crop you're thinking of and pre-soaking. For most of them, I imagine it doesn't matter that much. But with peas, where they are a little more susceptible to decay organisms, sometimes I like to give them that head start. Beans don't tend to be that susceptible, so they probably, they probably would germinate faster. I don't know that it's worth doing for them.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. One person was asking about sort of the minimum air temperature you would need to start seedlings in a greenhouse. This person does have a heating mat.
So for most seedlings, you're going to want at least 65 to germinate. Ideally warmer. Mine are in, like I said, the room with the wood stove. So it's usually, well, because we're heating the whole house with that one wood stove, it's usually quite warm in there. And one trick is to also put them higher up in the room. The air in our houses tends to stratify. So the temperature up at the top of the room is usually warmer than down at the bottom. Some people will put them on top of their fridge. Your fridge tends to actually have a fair amount of warmth up there. Just don't forget about them, and get them somewhere else where there's a lot of light once they're up and going. But yeah, ideally, your ideal conditions, probably like 75 in terms of, for most crops. Some are actually going to do better warmer, some are going to do better cooler. It's really crop specific, but just like a general 70 to 75 range is pretty ideal for most of them.
Okay, but if you were germinating them, say indoors, you could afford to have a slightly cooler space for them to grow up. Is that right?
Right. If you germinate them warm enough, then it can be cooler.
Yeah.
Like 65 is going to be fine for most garden plants.
Okay, awesome. We are almost at 1:15. Let me just throw out a couple more quick ones at you before we head our separate ways, Caleb.
Sure.
Let's see. One person was wondering about starting seeds in porous bags. I think this was when you were talking about the need for airflow. Is that something you would recommend or something you've ever done?
I know that there's like larger grow bags that people put big plants into. And I think as long as the top is open enough that air can exchange with the soil, and that there's enough drainage that water isn't, staying stagnant in it, then it's just the same as any other container.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Okay. And now two last ones. Somebody who has Pro Mix, would you recommend adding anything to that to make it better for starting seedlings?
So ProMix is hard because there's a brand name ProMix, and then like there's a lot of really similar seedling mixes that everybody just kind of calls ProMix.
Mhm.
There's conventional formulations of ProMix, there's organic formulations of ProMix. It really just depends on what is in your mix. And so I can't say. Yeah. So if it's peat based, and it's just for peat and fertilizer, there's no like compost and like beneficial microorganisms, you may want to consider adding in some sort of beneficial microorganisms, but just be careful of what you're adding, right? Make sure you know that you're only adding the good ones, like maybe a commercial product. Don't necessarily just throw in compost that you're not sure that it's high quality. Because you could always be adding issues at the same time.
Okay, great. And let's see, one last one. Somebody wondering about watering the seedlings that are under lights. Do you need to be super careful with this? Do you have to worry about the plants dripping onto the lights below if you have multiple levels?
So ideally, you've already got them in trays that are going to catch most of it. And ideally, you're not getting the top part of the plants too wet. You're getting the water towards the soil as much as possible, right? Try to water the roots, not the tops. That being said, I've spilled water, I've spilled coffee on my grow lights, and it hasn't been an issue yet, fingers crossed. I think shop lights are built to be a little bit moisture resistant. I would not want them submerged. Just, anything electric, you're going to want to try to keep it dry if you can. And ideally, you're already preventing that water from draining down onto your floor anyway. So just do your best. Little splashes here and there, I haven't seen be a problem.
Okay, great. And last question, should you be tickling or loosening up the root balls in cells when you're transplanting?
Yeah, it's going to vary based on the crop. Like melons do not like root disturbance. So just plant it as gently as possible and
Okay.
get it into the soil as soon as you can, and hope that that's why you don't want a root bound melon seedling. Tomatoes are pretty darn rugged. And if you have a tomato seedling that is root bound, I mean, sometimes you take it out of the container and you pull out a knife and you just slice each side a couple times, and that will cause those roots to branch out, and some of them will die and you don't really care, as long as you're getting enough water to the plant that it can deal with the shock. So it's going to be a very crop by crop thing. And if the root ball's not getting overgrown and it looks like the roots could easily go off into the soil, I wouldn't bother, because anytime you're disturbing them, you are giving the plant a little more shock, transplant shock, than you would be if you don't need to do that.
Okay, yeah. Great. Well, okay, suddenly it's 1:19 and we better tie this up. Thanks a lot, Caleb. That was great.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.